Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again today. We're back for day 2 of Arts Tune-Up, Preservation Tips for Artists. If you're just joining us, my name is Brianna McGillivray. I am the Civic Art Program Coordinator with the LA County Department of Arts and Culture. And I'm joined with my co-host, Lelenia Vilanowith, who is our Conservation and Collections Manager. And we're super excited to be hosting Shannon Brogdon Grantham, who will be presenting today on the topic of unlikely collaborators, how conservators can support artists' practices. And if you're unfamiliar with Arts Tune-Up, this is on with the county dedicated to opening up more resources around arts management for arts administrators and artists. But lately we've been kind of expanding the scope to focus more on resources and tools that are directly relevant to helping artists develop their artistic practices. So with that in mind, this is our first series focused on preservation and collections care topics for artists. And at the end of this session or in the coming days, we'd love to hear from you all. If there's other topics or themes that you would like to be made available, just let us know. So I'm going to pass it over to Lelenia.
Good morning or afternoon to everybody. Welcome to our second day of the Arts Tune-Up. We're really excited you're taking the time to join us. And so we had 3 technical talks yesterday, and we're happy to feature Shannon Brogdon Grantham today on more of a conversation of the collaborativeness and relationships between the artist and the conservator. Shannon Brogdon Grantham is the photograph and paper conservator at the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute. Her primary areas of focus include collections-based conservation research, treatment, and preventive care of photographic and paper-based collections across the Smithsonian. She routinely collaborates with other conservators and scientists at MCI, as well as collections care professionals and curators at different Smithsonian museums. An area of conservation close to her heart are teaching and mentoring, and Shannon has been involved in numerous programs to promote equity and inclusion in the field. So I'm going to share Shannon's presentation for her. But join me in welcoming Shannon for her presentation now. So welcome, Shannon.
Thank you, Lelenia, and thank you, Brianna. Thank you both for pulling all this together and making these talks so available to everyone. I think this is a great session. So hello and welcome to everybody. As Lelenia mentioned, I'm Shannon Brogdon Grantham. I am a photograph and paper conservator. So my area of expertise, of course, is in that those materials, but today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the collaborative relationships that artists and conservators can have to essentially make an artist's vision come into fruition, continue to maintain artistic intent, and all of those wonderful things. All right, so next slide. So the first slide here I want to show you is there's a number of ways that we as conservators can support an artist's practice, but the 3 major ways that I have identified that I notice routinely throughout my work and the work of my colleagues is that we do artist interviews, collaborative research, and the decolonizing art spaces. And I've created this little graphic because I feel like they're all inherently connected in a lot of ways. And so, you can start at one point and end up in all the different directions. And of course, this is just a broad brush of the ways in which we can work together. But I feel that it encompasses these are the big points, and other things can fall underneath them. But these 3 areas I would say are the top 3. Okay, so next slide. So just to give a little bit more background on exactly what conservators do, because I know in the past couple of 3 sessions, they talked a lot about materials and, things that we notice when we're working with artifacts and ways that we preserve them. But essentially, conservators' work involves the preservation and care of works of art and cultural heritage. It's often called a 3-legged stool, and I put the great 3-legged stool there because we have experience in art history, science, and studio art, and our practice is bounded by ethics as well as a number of other skills that we need to care for artwork. With this specialized knowledge, we can be an excellent collaborator to an artist in helping them preserve their artist integrity and better understand their materials and really bridge that gap between the technical and the artistic. Because sometimes you might have a vision of what it is that you want to create, or you have a particular material that you've selected that you want to articulate your vision, but sometimes it may not necessarily come into fruition in the way that you thought it would. And it's sometimes a material choice that, maybe the working properties or something like that you don't really understand them, or you don't know how to make them work to your benefit. And that's when a conservator can be of great use, because we have all this knowledge on materials and we're always eager to do research. So because art conservation requires a careful examination of a work of art, and understanding of materials from their composition and working properties, we're positioned to have this keen understanding of an artist's goal. And I have to say, one of the things that I really have enjoyed and appreciate about being a conservator is that we're one of the few arts professionals that actually see works of art from the inside out. We think about them from their basic components, like, all of those parts put together to make material that ultimately make a work of art. And so I would say we spend out of all of the professionals in museum setting, we spend the most time with the artifacts, because we have to examine them to either prepare them for exhibition or assess them for a survey or for other reasons, research. And that gives us this opportunity to really understand an artwork or a technique or a material from a very intimate way. And that is something that a lot of professionals in the arts don't necessarily have the luxury of doing.
Shannon, I think you muted yourself. You're muted. Okay, got it? No, you're muted.
Is it now unmuted?
You're muted now. I can hear you.
Okay, I have this thing on my side that says my speaker is not working. Please check your connection or use a different speaker. So I don't know, but you can hear me though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so next slide. So to further dive into this topic, I created this Venn diagram so you can kind of see. I mean, these are just basic things. I didn't go into all of the weeds here, but I pulled out a few kind of ways in which the artist thinks about the artwork and they're creating the artwork, and the conservator who is preserving the artwork thinks about the artwork from a material standpoint as well. And then in the middle there, you see we have this shared goal of preserving and maintaining the artistic integrity, but also appreciating and understanding the materiality of things. That's one thing that I have noticed from my own practice as I wouldn't really call myself that, but when I was making artwork and working around other artists, that was something that we all appreciate materials, and what you like and what you don't like. And so that's the same goes for conservators. Next slide. So the first topic that I want to cover is the artist interview. So many of you may think back to the times that you've been interviewed about your work, not necessarily for preservation or conservation purpose, but maybe it was a profile for an article about you or an exhibition opening or something along those lines that's written for the general public. This type of interview can always, and often reveal a lot about your work or an artist's work, but it doesn't always dial down into the specifics of your practice. Most of the time, it's speaking more broadly about your artistic intent or your vision or your, impetus behind creation of the work, but not necessarily the materials, and maybe a little bit about the materials. So in comes the conservation focused artist interview. And this art interview really hones in on both the why and the how of an artist's career, a specific body of work, inspiration, material choices, et cetera, et cetera. And so yesterday, Lastarsha mentioned in her session that we don't always have the luxury of speaking with an artist about their work and their intent or how they want their work to be reserved. And that's something that we're often faced with because the artist is deceased or maybe no longer making work or doesn't want to talk about it. But we rely in those instances, we rely on primary sources relating to the artist, whether it be other works in their body, in their body of work or their portfolio, or people who knew them, people who know their work, people who are familiar with their work, reading about their work, research that's already been done about their work, kind of diving into the archives. And we often are working in consultation with curators for this purpose. But with the artist interview, as you can see on the slide, it captures these key points directly from the artist that really answer a lot of the questions that we would have, once the work is acquired by a museum, or even if it's, not going to be acquired, but just going on exhibition, how it should be displayed and all of those very important details. But I think for me, in my experience doing artist interviews, the one aspect that I've really appreciated is the rapport that I'm able to build with the artist. So in this slide, I have a few pictures of a project that I'm currently working on with the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. Although I mentioned I am a photograph and paper conservator, and on the screen are textiles, the project is actually to conserve a group of photographically illustrated quilts. So in doing this project, because that material is very unusual, we've been relying heavily on artists who work in this medium and who have familiarity with the different techniques. It may not be the same artists that produce this work, but artists that have familiarity with the techniques of creating a photograph on textile, because it's something that's very novel and there isn't really any scholarship on it. And so these images show one of the afternoons that we had the local quilting guild, the Daughters of Dorcas and Sons. It's a local African-American quilting guild, visit the Anacostia Museum, and they have artifacts that are in the Anacostia Museum's collection. And so we pulled out all of the quilts that we have in the collection that are from, created by members of the guild, some of who have since passed on, some of who are still alive, and were able to talk about exactly what they did and comment on, their experience making the work and their knowledge and everything. And it was probably one of the best experiences I've ever had, because we had about 20 folks there. They all came and they were all very excited, and they all went around the room and shared something personal about like why they like to quilt and those types of things. And that's something that you just can't get when you're reading about an artist in a book or reading about a technique in a book. So I think the artist interview for me has always been something that I've valued, and I feel like it really connects the human element of the creation of the artwork to, once it's collected in a museum or being put on display. Okay, next slide. So in this slide, it's just a list of different organizations that I feel are really doing kind of groundbreaking work or have done groundbreaking work in the avenue of the artist interview and have published on it. So of course, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, which are both Smithsonian museums, The Artist Initiative at SF MoMA has been a really wonderful ongoing project, and they've kind of captured a lot of different types of artists, so not just one specific type of material. They've been looking at reprinting of photographic materials, and that's something, of course, that I have been interested in. And then the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art, Inca, and the Voices of Contemporary Art, VOCA, have both been, I would say, the two organizations that have really done the work to develop kind of a strategy or a technique for doing artist interviews. And they routinely host artist interview workshops, and they're well attended by not just conservators, but collections managers and even artists. And it gives you an opportunity to really understand how the artist interview in particular is different from just a regular interview, and how to even approach it. Because the thing about doing an interview is it doesn't have to be this very super formal experience and awkward experience. I mean, it really can be something that is a conversation, and that's how it should be. Which is why I say levels of formality may vary. Sometimes you may just be presented with something like a questionnaire, or you might actually sit down and do a full-on interview with video and everything. So it just depends. It could be in your studio, it could be in a gallery installation, it could be, it could be at your home. But the major takeaway for all of these is that stakeholders must be included in the discussion. All the stakeholders must be included in the discussion, because that really gives the, those who want to get the information to be able to ask their questions and put out there exactly what it is, that we all would hope to get from the interview. And then I've actually linked some resources there that if you want to go and do some further reading on the techniques and what these institutions are doing, you can check that out. Okay, next slide. So this is just a slide I like to throw in that shows some of the artist interviews that I've been involved in that I would say are probably on the less formal side. And I have to say that in those experiences, those are the ones that are most memorable. I actually haven't really done a lot of super formal artist interviews. They a lot of times have been during the installation of a work, or having the opportunity to visit a place and being invited to visit an artist's studio or their home, or setting up a meeting with an artist to tell them I'm working on a project and I'm interested in your knowledge about this subject because I know this is an area that you work in. And so I found that these conversations are best, if you allow them to flow, it can flow very well. And it's something that doesn't have to be so structured and formal, which there's nothing wrong with structure and formality. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I found that when I was first starting to do these, there was a lot of, I don't want to say politics around it, but essentially politics around it. And that can come into play when you're working in an institution where it's not just, conservator, you have other stakeholders involved. And so that's one thing that I have always tried to work to minimize, is the level of politics, because I think no one really gets the information that they want or has the experience that they want when you allow that to be part of this experience. Okay, next slide. So the next topic is collaborative research. And so I think the importance of selecting stable inert materials has been discussed in prior talks, and you've heard that, and it's something that I think is probably the biggest takeaway in creating artworks. But I have to say that we conservators should admit that we enjoy the challenge of preserving materials of all qualities, because it does give us a chance to do research. It does give us a chance to explore and understand why something is behaving a certain way, or doing a certain thing, or helping an artist, select a material. So I feel that the research is further augmented when the artist is involved and they can share the details on the types of materials that they use, even if it's just a general guess, because sometimes you may not always remember, the exact product or a material. You just remember, oh, it was a green paint. So areas that we can do this research include like the material behavior. To use the tintype as an example on the screen, why is this severe flaking happening? It's something that, having worked with tintypes in my experience, I've never really come across anything this severe. And so in this, the artist in this case would have been able to elaborate on their technique that they used for coating the tintype plate, any additives that they may have used in the coating method, or whether they followed traditional recipes for coating that would have been found in 19th century literature. That discussion would have led to, the best approaches for treatment and preservation. For something like a tintype, which has very few options for treatment or straightforward preservation because of its sensitivity of the material. But to talk about, a historic document or something like a work of art on paper that may require something more straightforward, like standard framing, matting and framing, though standard, I use that word very carefully because there is no such thing as a standard. I mean, there are certain standards, but every object is treated like an individual when you're working with a conservator. And then lastly, to highlight an option for, discussing options for reproduction and fabrication. So I have a clip there from Heath Sterl's video, How Not to Be Seen. This was a piece that was acquired by the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in 2016 when I was working there as a conservation fellow. And in addition to the video component, it's a 16-minute long video. The installation requirements for this piece include a built environment, as described by the artist in the acquisition notes, to include multiple chromogenic photographic prints and 3-dimensional display boxes to be constructed out of a specific type of material. And the materials for this built environment were to be printed and produced by the museum, and only the digital files and diagrams were provided by the artist. In this project, I actually wasn't able to have direct contact with the artist, but I was able to communicate through the curator in charge of this acquisition to gain more specific details on the artist's preference for installation. And in that project, I was able to develop a strategy and budget for the creation of this built environment that would both meet her artistic intent and fulfill her vision of the work. And I know that ultimately I wasn't around when they were doing the printing and fabrication of the materials. By that point, I'd left the museum, but ultimately the work did go on display, and it did, was installed to the specifications that I helped contribute to. Next slide. And then lastly, talking about decolonization of art spaces. So rightfully so, this topic has been very pressing as of late. There's no way to escape the reality that museums are not neutral. But one way that we as conservators can help to decolonize these spaces is to allow the voices of the original practitioners to be prioritized over the art experts. So if I'm working on something, and it may be a material that I've spent a lot of time researching, maybe something I've spent, I've done all of this, but I would always prioritize the voice of someone who, this is something they know better than I know. I would always prioritize that voice over my own. There are things that I can contribute, but there's much more that individual can contribute than I can, even though I may have researched it and read about it and made it or whatever. And so that's something that I feel that conservators are really poised to be able to do, because we have this understanding of materials and that type of thing. And another way that we can help decolonize spaces is work with artists to incorporate traditional techniques into the preservation. So in this image, this was an image from a project I worked on when I was an intern at the National Museum of the American Indian. And they had a group of Tapa cloth makers come to the museum, and they had a whole program. I wasn't involved in all of the program, but they were there for at least a month or two working with the museum's collection of this material. And there was a session that we were all able to join in on and look at some of the traditional tools that they use. Some of the tools they had brought with them, some of the tools were in the museum's collection. And they were talking about how they create, how these these tools are used to create the materials and how they can be used to preserve them. And that was something that was really important to not only the museum, but to include the traditional workers, makers of this material, so they could contribute and help with the preservation of these artifacts before they went on display or, contribute to that research. So that's something that conservators are constantly doing when we're working with all types of materials, not just materials that are from living cultures, but works of art as well. And then the last thing I like to bring up is respecting those latent qualities, the life force or the Ashay that's contained within a work. Something I learned when I was an undergrad is the terminology Ashay, and it's used, it's a Yoruba term that's used to describe this life force that every object, animate or inanimate, has. And it's something that stuck with me ever since I was an undergrad. And it's something that I think about constantly when I'm working with works of art, especially something that was owned or made by a specific person. I related a lot to my own personal family treasures, but it can be applicable to anything. And so I think that's something that we always have to remember when we're working with things is, you are contributing to the longevity of this work, or you're becoming part of its story. And so what can you tell about that story as you work on it? And that's something that conservators, again, are well placed to do. Next slide, please. Okay. So I just want to talk briefly or talk a little bit about kind of a case study or an example of the kind of the culmination of all the three topics that I've discussed in this one particular work by Naranjo Morse, Always Becoming. It's a sculpture group that consists of 5 sculptures made of clay, yellow locust wood, bamboo, pottery sherds, agave fiber, and stone. Each figure represents a member of a family group, and they were all constructed on site at the National Museum of the American Indian in summer of 2007. The sculptures were built by Ms. Naranjo Morse and her family and friends, and the process was documented by video, photography, written notes, and diagrams and drawings, all of which is kept in permanent record at the museum for future reference. In his letter commemorating the 25th anniversary of the National Museum of the American Indian, Museum Director Kevin Gover writes, "The sculptures range in height from 7.5 to 16 feet tall, and were built using natural materials to represent origin, family, and belonging in Native cultures. The pieces, painstakingly crafted by Santa Clara Pueblo artist Nora Naranjo Morse, are designed to melt back into the earth over time, to reflect the past that shaped the sculptures, their change and evolution, much like the Native people whose heritage they represent." Next slide. And I highlight this project because I think it's a fine example of the type of collaboration that can come between an artist and conservator, and in this case, also collections management staff at the museum. So every year, the museum staff, interns, fellows, and Ms. Naranjo Morse's daughter, Eliza, perform annual care and maintenance on the sculptures. They document the change and they add new elements, which has resulted in an evolving community of artists that conserve the sculptures, bringing their own experiences and stories to the work. And you can see here in the images, obviously this is an outdoor work of art, it's outdoor sculpture. So it is it's going through all of the elements, and that's part of its life cycle. It's part of how it is supposed to melt back into the earth. And something that I found that I really appreciated about the project is that there's some elements, like for example, the robin's nest that was found inside one of the sculptures. They leave those elements behind. That Ms. Naranjo Morse sees those as part of the work, and that is important to her artistic vision. And of course, for conservators, a lot of times we're thinking about the most pristine condition and keeping an object or an artifact static. But for something like this that is essentially alive in very many ways, how do we it required a little bit of cognitive dissonance. How do we preserve something like this, but also allow it to take its course? And that's something that they have really worked out, I think, at NMAI in consultation with the artist and conservation and collections management. And so annually, like I said, they do the sculpture maintenance, and they've always include interns in the project. And that's something I was able to work on when I was an intern, and I've had interns since then that have worked on it. And everyone has always said that it's such a transformative experience. And so that just goes to show the power of these types of collaborations and the impact that they can leave on individuals. And I like to close with this one quote from Gail Joyce, who was the collections manager there at NMAI for many years. She's since retired. And she said in the paper that they wrote on the project, normally we have an artist intent form at NMAI that documents the living artist's intent for the future care of their work. This is based on an assumption of maintaining stasis for an object. As we sat down to do an interview with Nora about her wishes, we realized that we were creating a living document that would follow nature, nurture, and Nora with her evolving concept of the artwork. Monitoring major weather events and documenting the results of heavy thunderstorms or exceptional snowfalls are part of my ongoing communications and photo log with Nora. All right, next slide. So in closing, I'd like to just add and state that, artists and conservators, or other museum professionals for that matter, can forge a harmonious partnership. I think in the best possible outcome, that is what we as conservators hope for. We always are eager to talk to artists about their work, and we hope that you all as artists would be eager to talk to us about it. I think if we can recognize our mutual interests and the shared goals that we have, we can work together to fulfill the artistic intent. Something I do want to point out is that artists should definitely feel empowered to reach out to conservators and build a strong working relationship. I know sometimes when you're working on something, you just need to talk to somebody about it. And conservators are often always ready and willing to talk through ideas, whether it's material choices or why something, how to recognize your vision. I think we're always open and willing to talk about that with you. And it's something that you should definitely feel like you can reach out to a conservator and get that type of feedback. And lastly, I'd like to say the broad knowledge that we have it can be beneficial at all stages. So whether it's before you even start the work and you're beginning to do preparatory drawings, or you just have an idea, the beginning, middle, and end, and beyond. And of course, that's something that we ultimately will be doing, is caring for your work long beyond its creation. So that's definitely something to consider, and a way in which we can all work together to realize your artistic vision and support your artistic practice. All right, but last slide. So thank you so much for your attention. And I just want to say thank you for the LA County Department of Art and Culture, and of course the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute. I really appreciated being invited to participate in this. And if there's any questions that you have after this session, please feel free to contact me directly. My email address is there. You can search my name on Google, and it'll probably pull up MCI's webpage with my bio and everything. So you could also find me there. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Shannon. That was fantastic. We do already have a question in the chat.
Oh boy.
How do traditional preservation techniques differ from those that are currently taught in the field of conservation?
I would have to say, again, it does depend on the material. So I would say that for photography, for example, photographers may have been trained to do their spotting on a photograph using a specific type of dye-based media or ink or what have you. And now if we were to do the same type of retouching, is what they would have called it, or spotting, we would refer to it as inpainting or loss compensation. We may not necessarily use that same material, or in some instances we might use the same exact material if we can get our hands on it, because it's the only thing that will actually work to do, you know, the spotting or retouching that needs to be done on a work. When looking at something like a cultural artifact or something that's used for rituals, conservation might use one material and the culture might use another material. And that doesn't necessarily mean that conservation can't switch over to using that material that the culture is using, because a lot of times they have the same working properties. So that's something that I remember when I was, again, an intern, and we had some individuals coming through, and I was cleaning these belt. They were like a silver plated circular adornment on a belt, and I was cleaning it with calcium carbonate, and the lady walked by and she's like, "Oh yeah, we just clean them with toothpaste." I mean, essentially that's the same thing. Calcium carbonate and toothpaste are essentially the same thing. There's a lot of similar properties. So I just think, you know, it just depends. And that's why having these conversations is important, because there's a lot of overlap.
Cool. We have another question. Until when do you think we should respect the artist's intent? Some artists are known to change their mind. Is there a point where the artwork is beyond the artist?
That's a good question. I know that in the museum setting, when a work of art, of course, is acquired by a museum, it becomes the museum's. And of course, we always engage the artist if it's a, you know, obviously if it's a living artist. But in an instance where, you know, the artist changes their mind, I think that's a discussion more on how, you know, how the work should exist. If the museum acquired it as one way, then it would have to be a discussion amongst the museum, because they do own that work, as well as the artist if they want to change the work. I can, thinking of examples where we've had artists that want to reprint photographic materials. It's a slippery slope. I think it's always on a case by case basis. There's not a one size fits all answer to that. And it would involve having a number of stakeholders at the table. And in this example that I'm thinking of, reprinting something that has, say it's a color photograph that was made in the 70s or 80s, and it's since changed color, you know, color shifted. It did kind of what it was going to do anyway, because that material is inherently unstable. The artist didn't like the way they looked and didn't want them displayed, but the museum owns them and they do want to display them. So that involved a conversation with the museum and the artist on how we can approach reproducing these materials. That was the decision that was made, was to reproduce them, but involving the artist at all phases, as well as the conservation team at all phases, to select a material that would be most identical to the original material, because now, you know, you can't get that original material because it was made in the 70s. So how do you go about doing that? And it's always a conversation, and it evolves. I mean, it started out as one thing and we ended up with coming to a solution that I guess met everybody's needs, and the artist was happy and the museum was happy.
Going back to the Tapa, how would the Tapa be traditionally maintained?
That's a good question. It's been over a decade now since I've even looked at that project. So I would have to look it up and get back to you on how they would have maintained it traditionally. I do know that when the individuals came to do the month-long work at the museum, that was one of the projects that they really were focused on, was actually doing the repair and the treatment of it. So I'd have to go back and look at my notes to see exactly what they did.
And we have another question. There's been discussion recently about the rights of a subject of a photo. Should the subject's intent also be considered or sought?
That's a really good question. I haven't seen the discussions, the recent discussions on that, but it's definitely something that I'm not surprised, excuse me, it's being brought up as a topic of consideration. I think, again, excuse me, it's a tricky thing, because if you're in a situation and you're a model and you're doing this, you have this agreement with the artist, I mean, that's something that you'd want to make sure all of those provisions were in place, just in case you were to change your mind later on about being depicted in this manner. I mean, it's these are topics that I think we're beginning to just start thinking about as a field, and I don't know what the right answer to that would be.
Yeah, I think the most recent, or one of the most recent conversations, was Richard Prince, right, and his use of subject in artwork, and bigger conversation.
Much bigger conversation.
Can you talk a little bit about confidentiality and what it means when speaking to an artist?
Absolutely. So one thing I didn't mention in my talk, and I wish I should have mentioned this, but all of the work that we do in conservation is kept confidential. So when I write a treatment proposal or a conservation report, that is kept confidential. Now, since I work for the Smithsonian government agency, I mean, and those materials, those objects belong to the public trust, it's a little different. But if I were, for example, a private conservator, all my records would be kept confidential. So anything I write about a work of art that a client has brought in to have treated, all of that information would be, only between myself and the client. And it's the same goes for the artist interview. So in my experiences with the artist interviews that I have done, we have had paperwork that was drawn up so the individuals could, consent to having their thoughts and ideas shared publicly or not. And that's something that it's a conversation, but it's also gotten in writing. And it's very important to get that information, down in writing, because there are things that you're doing as an artist that, it's your secret. It's your special, technique that you don't want everybody to know, but for conservation of the work, it might help in its long-term preservation. So it's something that you may want to share with the conservators who will be preserving your work, because they'll be able to maintain it. And of course, that breach of confidentiality, if you have it in writing, then it becomes a legal issue. So that's something that we definitely take that very seriously.
I'm wondering, Shannon, if you can talk a little bit more about it. In your mind, is there a bit of a difference between an artist interview and a studio visit? And thinking even for the conservators or arts administrators in the audience, if there's some advice or some insight on how to make that the most comfortable, the most beneficial for the artist, just in your experience.
Absolutely. I'd have to say that is something that you would want to establish early on. So if you're making a visit to an artist studio and it's impromptu, that might not be the time to actually sit down and have the in-depth conversation about the material. Or maybe if it starts to go down that route, or it starts to go in the direction of feeling like there's more technical information that you might want to document or record or keep track of, that's when you put a pin in the discussion and say, okay, this is something that we definitely would want to have in our records so we can care for your work. And then you transition it from being this more casual studio visit to an actual artist interview, and you can utilize the INCA guidelines or the VOCA guidelines or recommendations. I don't want to say guidelines, because they are really, conversations can be organic. And so, you might have a list of questions, but it ends up taking a different direction. And that's what's happened in my experience. And so the images I put on the screen showing different artist interview conversations. Those were definitely more in the informal conversation style, but later evolved into, you know, a bigger discussion that I would consider to be more of like an interview, a true interview, where information was documented about their process and, you know, their artist intent and all things relating to a particular body of work, or how something should be installed, or even how it should be cleaned in the case of the Patina Pucci photographs.
Right.
A participant would like to know more about Ashay concept, and are there publications or writings or where places we can learn more about that idea?
Yes, so I would say that I learned the most about it from African art classes that I'd taken in African art, and then I had a professor, Dr. Arturo Lindsay, who built his entire practice, his art historical and his artist practice around this topic, and he was the one that introduced me to the concept. And there is a book, I cannot think of the artist's name, but I can see the book cover, and I can send that to Lalenia or Brianna so it can be distributed, or you can write to me directly, and I can send it to you. There is a book that goes in, like dives deep into the topic of Ashay and how, you know, everything has a life force, everything, you know, everything has some sort of activation component to it. And we should think of all things like that. And I have to say that it really just changed my perspective on artifacts, because not only do you have the Ashay of whoever created it, but for example, something that someone owned, it has that as well. And there's a power there. I mean, there's something about going into a collection storage space that I find, and you know, this might sound a little woo-woo, but I really don't care, because I think it's a real thing, because I've experienced it. But there's something powerful about being in a space that has works created by different people, different cultures, all of that energy. I mean, it's just something, there's something powerful about that. And I'd be happy to dig up that reference and pass it along so you can have a look at it, because I think it really can articulate it a lot better than I can, but also gives more of the cultural significance to it.
Well, and I love that you share that, Shannon, because I think it adds such an interesting dimension to these topics around increasing our capacity for sensitivity, cultural sensitivity around just kind of the objects that we're speaking about, handling, you know, disseminating, you know, and I think that that's a really beautiful like way to apply that to your work. So
Absolutely.
And we have an artist question. What advice would you give to an artist who wants to explore new materials that will degrade over time as part of the artist's intent?
That's a really good question. So I would say there was a good example given yesterday during Lastarsha's talk when someone was talking about using cardboard, I think it was. Just doing some tests with the material. For example, if you have, you know, the material in your possession and it's something that you're planning to use for an outdoor sculpture, you know, make a maquette and make several of them maybe of that material, and do your own experiment to see how it behaves in direct sun, how it behaves in the shade, how it behaves, you know, after being in, you know, on display for a year, something like that. So you can start doing your own tests. But I would also say that if you do have access to, you know, to reach out to a conservator, maybe talk to them about that material and the properties that you like about it, or what you're expecting from it, or what you know, what your vision is for this material in your work. And they could help you kind of identify a more scientific approach to conducting an experiment that allows you to really test out that and maybe other materials that are of the same working property or something in that of that nature.
Going back to Ashay, is that concept applicable to Indigenous art as well? or cultural items? And does the book talk about African or other cultures?
The book that I'm thinking of in particular is speaking specifically about Yoruba artworks, but I do think that that term, it may have another, there's different terminology for it, but the concept is essentially that these things are living, they have a life force. So in indigenous culture, it may not be called Ashay, but it's still like a life force, a presence, something that gives that artifact power, or activates it, or something like that. So I think the terminology is really this word is specifically used in Yoruba culture, but it's every culture probably has a term that refers to this type of life force that I'm referring to.
We have a really great comment that says such an important conversation, not only for artists to hear, but also for conservators to think more broadly about what are considered best practices. Do you feel like you see a shift between, like you mentioned, the use of the word standard and the use that we use all the time in institution, best practices? So just wondering about your thoughts.
Yes. I think that we have to shift. I mean, I see it happening more, to use the Smithsonian as an example. We have, more historical or history focused museums, and we have our art museums, and we have our science museums. So I think in a lot of ways, it may have started with the more historical focused museums, because those collections really focus in on working with source communities, or, in order to even talk about the artifacts, you have to work with the source communities, which I think is very important. And it's slowly beginning to take its way into the art, collections, because I feel that up until a certain point, there's always been like this divide between the materials, like one is this and one is that. But in reality, if it's created by a person or a culture or a group, or whomever, it doesn't matter whether you call it art or cultural heritage. You still want to care for it in the same way, and you still want to make sure that the artist or the culture's intention for that particular artifact is maintained. And I think that we have to switch our mindset, and the only way to move forward and continue to remain relevant in the 21st century is to start allowing these voices to have a say in how their artwork or their artifacts are preserved, and thinking about those human components, because that's how they all connect us. And that's the, if people are not going to be able to connect with them, then they're not necessarily fulfilling their purpose of existing. So we have to change, we have to shift, and be more inclusive in that regard.
And in your work, this shift, how do you think, what is the relation of that to the strive for equity and diversity within the field of conservation itself?
So I think, having more individuals from diverse backgrounds working in conservation or working in preservation in these spaces, preserving artifacts that are from their culture, or even if they aren't from their culture, being able to have a conversation and feel empowered and comfortable doing that with the source community, and recognizing that you don't have all the answers. Even if it's something you think you know very well, you don't have all the answers. There's so much more to learn, and being open-minded and willing to do that. And I think that's the shift that I feel I'm seeing in conservation, and the folks that I work with at the Smithsonian and in other places, just this willingness to be open to other perspectives and new perspectives, and not being so rigid that because this is how it's always been done, that this is how it has to continue to be done.
And I, just taking that to something you said earlier, which I thought was really powerful about decolonizing the museum space or an institution, can also involve internal changes in process. So not just having the the standard be that curators only communicate with artists, but opening up that to conservators being involved in those conversations and kind of seeking to change up, traditional hierarchy, or moving away from the strict silos that we often work in, has a way of contributing to more cross collaboration, which benefits the audiences and the artists. And
absolutely. I mean, I think that is, if that more of that happened, where conservators and curators were able to feel that we all have something to contribute, and it's all very important, and we need to work together, and not saying that conservators and curators don't work together, because we do, and I have a number of great relationships with curators at the Smithsonian. But sometimes, like you said, it does become siloed, and that gets into the politics of things. And sadly, I don't know that that's changing as fast as I would like it to. But it's definitely something that should be considered in the structure, in the hierarchy of museums going forward.
We hope to have more programs like this where we can share resources that can be available to artists, so that they know, or not just artists, but the public know what institutions or municipalities, what we can provide or help them or support them. And that it's not just the curator, but it's the conservator, could be someone in education and programming and development, to have all these conversations on how to support their practice and to support their intent.
Absolutely.
yeah, because I think, just adding on to that, so often these institutions are like black boxes where we can't see in, and we don't know how everything relates. And so I think having more information, to made available to artists and the general public about who is working with whom, and what kinds of decisions are being made, and in turn then what to ask for, and what to demand, changes things, or helps produce change, in the right direction eventually.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. We are right on time.
Oh, wow. Look at that.
Thank you for this beautiful presentation, Shannon. I really, really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody else here enjoyed it, as you can see in the comments.
Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. This is a wonderful, wonderful talk. And yeah, there's just a lot to think about. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
And I am happy, like I said, to pass along that information about the book. I just have to go dig it up, and I can pass it along. I don't know how to best disseminate that information.
Yeah, just send it to me,
Okay.
and then I'll make sure everybody gets the your presentation too, if you
Okay.
want to share those slides. For everyone in the audience who was wondering, we did record this session, which we're really happy to share with you later. So yeah, we'll make all of that available.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so this was the only session for today, but tomorrow we come back with 3 sessions with Lily Doan on contracts with your installers and fabricators, some help with storage, handling, and transport with Magdalena Solano and Nyla Bird, and caring for drawings, photographs, and prints with Nicole Alvarado and Jacqueline Chi. So we hope to see you tomorrow as well.
Bye.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, everyone.